The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Patrick Kim, and I'm the Work Comp Specialist at Beere&Purves. And I want to thank you all for joining me on today's webinar. So I know things are starting to pick up for the fourth quarter, which is why I'm going to try to make this webinar just a little shorter than usual. So something that often comes up with your startup groups is that while you're writing a startup business, a question that comes up is, does the group need workers' compensation? So this webinar is really just to help give you some guidelines on whether or not to determine, or to at least help you determine whether or not a group needs workers' compensation. So as always, this information is pretty general to the state of California, and this webinar is being recorded, so if you miss anything, please don't worry. We'll be sending you a link to the recorded session just afterwards. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to message me either in the little text box, or you can email me afterwards as well. I'm more than happy to do either. So for today's agenda, we're just going to start off with when workers' compensation is needed and go over the various staff types and as well as their individual considerations. So this is 1099s, W-2s, and independent contractors. Then we're going to go over what's considered proof of coverage. What does the carrier or an entity need in order to verify that a group does indeed have workers' compensation coverage? And this ties a little bit into more of PEO groups and temp agencies. And then I'll be providing kind of a short explanation regarding monopolistic states. Then I'll finish off with some quick tips for recognizing staff that do indeed need to be covered by work comp. And then of course, we'll finish off with a nice Q&A session. So to start off, when is workers' compensation needed? To put it this as broadly as possible, so long as there's an employee or human being doing work for someone in the United States, that employee within the United States does indeed need to be covered by workers' compensation. It doesn't matter where the employee works from or what kind of work they do. Even if the employee works from home, they're a traveling person, like there's no office building that they work from directly. They're out just constantly on the move, working from Starbucks, something like that, or working from home or working remotely. That person still does indeed need to be covered by workers' compensation. Even payment methods is a non-issue either. So this is really for situations if an employee is being paid as a 1099, commissions, profit sharing, bonus payments, that employee still needs to be covered by workers' compensation. And obviously, if an employee is receiving a W-2, they do indeed need to be covered by work comp. So this brings me to a point that's often used to justify not having workers' compensation on the part of the group, or causes a group to be charged additional premiums unexpectedly. So they currently have a work comp policy, but because of some misunderstandings, perhaps they're being charged additional. So work comp and 1099s. So contrary to popular belief, 1099 staff do indeed need to be covered by workers' compensation. This typically might come up for a startup group that is utilizing 1099 staff or staffing agencies. The 1099 staff do indeed need to be covered either by the group's workers' compensation policy or the staffing agency's workers' compensation policy. If a group is exclusively using 1099 staff from a temp agency, make sure the group asks for proof that the temp agency is indeed providing coverage for the 1099 staff, and to make sure that those staff are indeed on the temp agency's work comp policy. Really, the only exception to 1099 staff needing to be covered by a group's proprietary workers' compensation policy is where the 1099 staff is doing work that is completely unrelated to the group's primary businesses. So a very popular example, in my opinion, is a law office that might hire a plumber as a 1099 staff member. Since plumbing is extremely irrelevant to conducting legal services, the work comp carrier isn't going to include them, and there isn't going to be any sort of situation where a regulatory entity might say, well, because this person is doing work for you, you need to cover them. Well, technically not really, because again, the plumber is providing a service that is completely unrelated to legal services. The plumber isn't providing legal documentation, isn't providing legal services, etc. But even then, it's always a good idea to ask for proof of work comp coverage just to make sure that the 1099 staff, be it a plumber working for a law office or a temp agency, is covered by some sort of work comp policy. Because worst case scenario, that 1099 staff member might try to file a claim against the group's work comp policy. And if the 1099 staff member doesn't have their own proprietary coverage, most likely the group's work comp policy is going to have to pay out. Or if the group, God forbid, doesn't have work comp in place, they could be subject to paying for the 1099 staff members' medical fees. So another big point of contention is independent contractors. Sometimes employers will intentionally mark staff members as an independent contractor in order to avoid paying work comp premiums to just keep costs low. Something to seriously consider is that just because an employer says someone was hired as an independent contractor or believes that individual is an independent contractor or individual is being issued a 1099, that does not necessarily mean that a particular employee is in fact an independent contractor, be it a 1099 or otherwise. Unfortunately, the IRS, Employee Development Department, as well as the Division of Labor Standards Enforcement, or a CPA, can really give the explicit legal definition of what constitutes an independent contractor. And aside from getting a formal letter from an attorney, CPA, or government agency, really the best rule of thumb is just to make sure that if an employee is being considered as an independent contractor, is to ask for that individual's proof of workers' compensation insurance. From a carrier standpoint, being the work comp carrier, if they see an independent contractor on payroll, the carrier is automatically just going to assume that that person is a true employee of the organization, and charge premiums for the independent contractor unless the group provides proof that the contractor has proof of their own coverage. So what is considered proof of coverage? This might be something that is occasionally asked by the medical carriers. Or asking for what's a policy declaration page. Just something for everyone to consider is that proof of coverage comes in two forms for workers' compensation. It's a certificate of insurance or the workers' compensation declaration page, but pretty much the only item anyone really cares about is the workers' compensation declaration page. Typically, this is the first or second page of the policy declaration. It's typically a work comp policy doc is maybe 50 to 70 pages. It's going to be the first or second page of that entire document. It's going to show who's insured, the policy number, the workers' compensation effective date, as well as the coverage limits. Typically, when it comes to a certificate of insurance, that's not something that's going to fly. Pretty much a work comp certificate of insurance is just a fillable document that anyone can fill in by hand. It just requests for who the named insured is, or the group's name, along with their business address. Any special provisions like people that are excluded from workers' compensation, or anything like a waiver of subrogation. Another item it will ask for is the group policy number, as well as the effective date and term date of the workers' compensation policy. And really, when it comes to proof of coverage, typically the certificate of insurance just doesn't really fly with anyone because, again, it's something that anyone can fill out. Really, the certificate of insurance, from my experience, is only requested by a landlord. So let's say a group is renting out an office building. The landlord typically asks, okay, along with your proof of coverages, we would also like to see your certificate of insurance. Please have it written out to us by XYZ date. That's not something that the carriers usually accept, be it on the work comp side or on the medical carrier side. They always want to see that policy declaration that shows a policy number, effective date, group name, as well as the coverage limits. So to bring it back with the independent contractor, when an independent contractor is providing proof of coverage, so either that the carrier doesn't include them in work comp or just to make sure that the person's covered, the contractor's work comp effect date, bare minimum, must start on the date the contractor was hired. So let's say a contractor was hired 1/1/18, and when you request proof of coverage for them, the policy declaration says coverage starts on 2/2/18. Unfortunately, that's not going to fly. The independent contractor would be included for at least 1 month, well, I guess 28 days technically, on the group's work comp coverage, and that could throw a wrench in a medical submission as well. This isn't something I'm going to go over in too much detail, but essentially it's just forced coverage. Really what I'm referring to here is a situation where a group, they have a 1099 staff member or they have an independent contractor, and unfortunately neither the staffing agency that hired out the 1099 staff or the independent contractors, neither of them are able to provide proof of coverage. So what happens is on the work comp side, the carrier just says, you can't provide us proof of coverage. We don't want to get in trouble by any regulatory entities, so we will automatically include these individuals in workers' compensation coverage. So the group can expect to see typically a dramatic increase in their premiums or a unpleasant surprise with their end of year payroll audit. They find out that there's a catch-up balance because staff members that they thought would not be included in premium calculations are in fact included. For this situation, again, we just really have to make sure that the effective dates are in line. So again, if a 1099 staff member or independent contractor starts 1/1, when they submit proof of coverage, the effective date of that coverage must start on the exact same date they start work for the group itself. So if I'm a 1099 staff member and I start work with a new company on 1/1, my proof of coverage must show that my work comp policy also started on 1/1 as well. So really another question is, when is workers' compensation not needed? Usually this only applies to owner-only groups. It's very rare for an organization to have all of its staff members working outside the United States, but to have only the executive staff to be working in the United States. The reason I say owner-only groups, just to start off, is because for workers' compensation, if an owner does indeed elect to be covered on work comp, they're effectively filing a claim against themselves. So to try to keep things fair, owners typically are allowed to waive workers' compensation coverage. So in a situation where you have an owner-only group, you don't need work comp, to put it simply. Or if there's an organization where all the owners are working in the United States, but the rest of the staff are working outside the United States, then work comp would not be needed, because the workers' compensation laws really are only applicable to the United States and U.S. territories. Staff members being pulled from a temp agency that can provide proof of coverage, that's a situation where work comp would not be needed. But again, you absolutely have to make sure that the temp agency can provide you the policy declaration and the effective date matches up with when the group is hiring that 1099 staff member. Another situation where work comp is not needed or does not actively have to be pursued by you, the agent, is for monopolistic states. These are states where it is not possible to buy workers' compensation coverage via a private exchange. It's all through one exclusive public exchange. So typically for these states, what happens is group files to do business within that state. Someone within that state's equivalent of the Department of Industrial Relations will reach out to the group and say, hey, you're doing business in XYZ state. I'm your account manager. We need you to create a login so that we can start sending you workers' compensation policy docs and so that we can start invoicing you. At this time, monopolistic states are Ohio, North Dakota, Washington, and Wyoming. I believe the U.S. territories also have a monopolistic fund, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So just something to consider. Another consideration is that state funds usually are not able to write outside of their presiding state. So what this means is that, let's say Ohio, for example, you have a group that has headquartered in Ohio, so naturally they get work comp through the Ohio State Fund. But let's say they have a branch office in California. The group's California branch would need its own separate workers' compensation policy. So the group is going to get two work comp policies, one for Ohio and one for California. Just bear in mind, I'm not 100% sure if every single state fund is restricted to only writing businesses within their state. I believe there might be one or two that can extend coverage outside the United States, but that's something I still have to check up on. So, and just something to help you guys recognize staff that need work comp. Again, generally, if someone's doing work for someone in the United States, you need work comp. But to get a little more details, if a group is making payroll deductions on behalf of someone, that's a guarantee that that individual needs to be covered by work comp. A group dictates how to do an assignment or assigns work to someone. That's another big red flag to say that individual needs work comp. If the group is providing tools, equipment, software, or even training to a staff member, that member typically needs to be covered by workers' compensation. Of course, if the staff member is working in the US, that individual needs work comp, and HQ of the business is relevant as well. So let's say you have a company based in China. They're branching out to California. Even though the headquarters is in China, the California staff still need to be covered by workers' compensation. And of course, the biggest red flag is staff showing up on a DE9C or any other payroll documentation. Typically, this means that that individual does indeed need to be covered by workers' compensation. This is kind of a left field situation that happens sometimes, is what happens if there's no payroll? So workers' compensation is based on payroll. So the more payroll you have, the more premiums you have. The more premiums you have, or payroll you have, excuse me, let me start over. The more payroll you have, the higher premiums you can get. The less payroll you have, the less premiums you can get. But what about those situations where a group might not have payroll? For owners, so let's say it's an owner-only organization and they want to have work comp for whatever reason, at this time, effective January 1st, 2018, the carrier is going to assume the owners have a minimum payroll of $50,700, and that's going to be used to calculate premiums. Generally, when it comes to, let's say, a nonprofit organization that uses volunteer staff quite heavily, work comp does not have to be extended to volunteer staff. However, that might throw a wrench in terms of getting a quote in general. Let's say you have a nonprofit, they have 2 staff members, and 30 of their staff members are volunteer staff. Work comp carriers typically are going to kind of be a little uncomfortable providing coverage because the volunteer staff can actually request it, or the group itself can request to extend coverage to those volunteers. Another consideration is, what if staff are paid exclusively commissions? So what happens if an organization is not giving regular payroll to an employee, kind of like a realtor association? Well, what's going to happen is that because the realtor is performing work for a real estate agency, that person still needs to be covered by work comp. And the way their premium contribution is going to be calculated is going to be based on the average commissions for the group, or excuse me, for that particular realtor. So again, there's not really too many ways to work around work comp. Almost always it's needed. Really, the most common exception I find is for owner-only groups. So we're kind of starting to finish off. These are just some of the ways to connect with BNP. We have Twitter. We do have a YouTube channel where you can find more webinars like this. Of course, email and a LinkedIn. And if you wish to opt in, we also have a text message service that's more for relevant information. It's not going to be something that's spamming you all the time. It's more for rate changes, network updates, something that's particularly time sensitive. So I want to thank you all for your time and for joining me. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Let's take a look here. So for SB 189 for excluding officers, so this isn't something I want to get into, but since it's come up, why not? So for officers, there are several variations on what can be excluded. Professional corps, the owners of a professional corp, they can be waived from workers' compensation. For C corps, as long as a owning officer has at least 10% ownership, they indeed can be waived from work comp. However, they do need to sign that work comp waiver form. LLCs, as well as partnerships, they also are automatically excluded from work comp as well. What else? I believe there's one more organization. Unfortunately, it's escaping my mind right now, but definitely the one that usually comes up as a point of contention is professional corps, because a law office, for example, essentially the owning executive staff have to have some sort of indication that they are in fact practicing professionals. So this might be a law office where you have one owner. He or she is a practicing attorney. That individual could indeed be excluded from workers' compensation coverage. INC 15% when it's held title. I can definitely check the 15% ownership. There's a question indicating that corporations require 15% ownership in order for an eligible officer to waive. My understanding was that was the provision for AB 2889, I think, prior to SB 189. After that, I believe it got lowered to about 10%, in addition to allowing family members of a family corporation to be waived from coverage as well. However, there's some kind of tricky provisions, one of which was a closely related family member that retains at least a percentage of ownership that is a close family member to one of the primary owners, someone that has a significant portion of ownership. That closely related family member can be waived from work comp as well. Yes, AB 283 it was, and yes, SB 189 changed it to 10%. Okay, so were there any other additional questions regarding workers' compensation in general or recognizing staff members? Okay, so I think we're starting to peter off. So again, just to make sure, kind of general rule of thumb is if they're on payroll, they're going to need work comp because there's no way to hide it. Second, always make sure to ask that proof of coverage. And 3, owner-only groups typically almost never need workers' compensation coverage unless they really want to and opt in. But there's not really an incentive for that. Anyway, so if you have any additional questions or concerns, please let me know. We'll be emailing you a link with the material, with this PowerPoint, in addition to the recorded session, and my contact information will be held there as well. So if you have any additional questions or something comes up, let's say in the middle of fourth quarter, please feel free to ask me. I'll be more than happy to assist you. So with that, thank you all so much for your time, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.